Tonight, we drift back to a time before written memory, before human history truly begins, guided only by the oldest words ever pressed into clay. You are standing in your mind's eye in the cool, shadowy interior of a Sumerian temple, a structure built from sun-dried mud brick, its walls sloping inward in that distinct, ancient way that makes you think the architects were either geniuses or just really bad at using a plumb line. And the air is thick with the scent of damp earth, of burning cedar oil from a single, flickering lamp, and of something else, something profound and dusty. The scent of time itself compressed into layers of silt and ambition. This is the setting, the cradle, the very office where a scribe, his fingers stained with river clay and his mind humming with the weight of kings and gods, would take a stylus and begin to write a list, not a shopping list for barley and beer, though that would come later, but the mother of all lists, the Sumerian King List, a record of kingship descending from the heavens, a timeline so absurdly long it makes our modern calendars look like a hasty post-it note stuck to the fridge. And here is your first mainstream historical fact, served on a plate of baked clay. The Sumerian King List isn't just one list, it's several versions found on different clay tablets and prisms, the most famous being the Weld Blundell prism, a four-sided clay object covered in cuneiform that essentially says, "Once upon a time, kingship came down from heaven, and it was in Eridu," and then proceeds to name kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years each, which is either a profound theological statement about the nature of early rule or the ancient equivalent of a fisherman's tale about the one that got away, except the fish was a monarch, and it got away for 28,800 years. Before we wade into those deep, chronologically suspicious waters, we must ask what came before the list, what world existed that necessitated such a document. And I must warn you, this journey is through a landscape of conjecture, of archaeology and myth swirling together like milk and honey in warm beer, and you probably won't survive this without at least one raised eyebrow and a slightly altered worldview, so consider yourself forewarned. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and not because some script told you to. I'm looking at you, other bedtime history scriptwriters, with your predictable cadence and your excessive use of the word dreamscape. Where are you listening from, by the way? Whisper it into your pillow, tell your cat, make a note on your clay tablet. I always wonder if you're in a bustling city somewhere or a quiet village, if it's deep night or early morning, and the thought that we're all briefly sharing this temporal anomaly of a story is rather nice. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, back to the very beginning before the list, to a place called the Ubaid period, a stretch of time from about 6500 to 3800 BCE, where the people of southern Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, decided that swamps were actually prime real estate if you just drained them a little. Inventing irrigation and setting in motion, a chain of events that would lead to taxes, bureaucracy, and the deeply human frustration of standing in line, which is a joke, of course, because ancient Sumerian lines for barley rations probably moved with a brisk efficiency we can only dream of at the modern DMV. The Ubaid people were the setup crew, the ones who laid the foundations, literally and figuratively, for Sumerian civilization. They built the first temples on raised platforms, which would later evolve into the massive ziggurats that pierced the Mesopotamian skyline, essentially creating the world's first wholly real estate with a view. And they established social hierarchies, because someone had to be in charge of deciding whose irrigation ditch was encroaching on whose, a position of power that inevitably came with a fancy title and probably a nicer clay cup. This is where our scholarly debate quietly clears its throat in the corner of the temple. The debate is fundamentally about continuity, about whether the Sumerians were the direct descendants of these Ubaid people or whether they were newcomers who swept in, saw the impressive irrigation works, and said, "We'll take it. adopting and amplifying the local culture. It's a debate fought with pottery shards and skull measurements, and while the consensus leans toward significant continuity, the question of Sumerian origins still has enough mystery to fuel 100 doctoral theses and at least one questionable documentary on a fringe history channel. Imagine the world they inhabited, a flat, green delta laced with waterways, teeming with fish and fowl, a paradise if you didn't mind the occasional flood that could wipe your house off the map, which is why they invented gods to blame for such inconveniences, gods who needed houses, which is how we got those temples, a brilliant circular logic of divine responsibility and architectural innovation. Life was communal, centered around these temple complexes, which were not just churches but economic powerhouses, storehouses for grain, centers for craft production, and the original administrative hubs where the concept of accounting was born. A sobering thought that the very first written records might have been receipts, because humanity's first impulse upon developing writing wasn't to pen epic poetry, but to note that Lugal still owed 15 bushels of barley, a joke that writes itself. Really? Now let's indulge in a quirky, fringe interpretation, the kind that makes mainstream archaeologists sigh and pour themselves a strong drink. Some alternative theorists look at the Ubaid period and see not just the dawn of civilization, but the influence of something else, pointing to the distinctive Ubaid figurines with their elongated heads, reptilian features, and shoulder-up postures that look less like human worshippers and more like visitors from a particularly stylized sci-fi convention, suggesting these represent the Anunnaki, ancient alien gods who supposedly genetically engineered humanity to work as gold miners. A theory that requires you to ignore all the evidence of gradual cultural development in favor of a narrative where extraterrestrials with a gold fetish taught us how to dig ditches, which, if true, means our cosmic debt is probably astronomical, both literally and figuratively. It's a fun story, perfect for late-night speculation, but it does a disservice to the genuine, earthbound ingenuity of the Ubaid and Sumerian people, who, faced with a challenging environment, invented solutions so profound they shaped the next 10,000 years of human history, which is arguably more impressive than being given a manual by a lizard person in a spaceship. The transition from the Ubaid to the Uruk period, around 4000 BCE, is where things start to rev up, where the prototype becomes the product. The settlements grow into true cities, with Uruk itself becoming a massive, walled urban center, a place of wonders where the wheel, the plow, and most importantly, writing, emerged from the pragmatic needs of managing an economy of scale. Because when you're distributing beer rations to thousands of workers, you need a system more reliable than shouting, a point so often repeated in history classes that it has lost all humor. But imagine the first person who tried to convince his friend that cuneiform was better than just remembering who got what. Trust me, these little wedge-shaped marks in clay will revolutionize everything. You'll see. Writing, that magical technology, began not with kings or myths, but with those administrative tokens and seals, a slow evolution from a three-dimensional clay bulla containing little counters to two-dimensional impressions on a clay tablet. A process so bureaucratic in origin it's almost disappointing, like discovering that fire was invented to heat up middle management reports. Yet from this dry soil of accountancy, the flower of literature eventually grew, but that came later. First, they had to list every jar of oil, every field, every worker, and eventually every king, which brings us back to the list and what came before it. Before the written list, there was oral tradition, a hazy, malleable cloud of stories about great founders, flood heroes, and semi-divine figures who established order. These stories were the prelude, the software that would eventually be installed on the hardware of clay. The King List is, in many ways, an attempt to take that swirling oral cloud and pin it down, to create a linear, authoritative narrative of power from the very beginning of time to the present day. which for them was the early second millennium BCE, a project of immense political and theological importance for whichever king commissioned it, because nothing says, "My rule is legitimate," like being able to trace your office's lineage back to a god who handed kingship down from the sky. A public relations move so effective, we still use variations of it today, though now we use family trees and historical societies instead of claiming descent from the planet Nibiru. The antediluvian kings, the ones before the flood, are where the numbers become delightfully unhinged. Ululim ruled in Eridu for 28,800 years, and his successor Alaugar ruled for 36,000 years, numbers that make Methuselah look like a spring chicken and have led to all sorts of creative explanations, from scholars suggesting they represent dynastic cycles or astronomical calculations to fringe enthusiasts claiming they are literal, evidence of when gods walked the earth, because clearly, a being that lives for tens of thousands of years would spend its entire reign in one small Sumerian city, managing irrigation disputes and the temple sheep roster, which is a full-time job, to be fair. The flood itself is a central reset button in the list, a great cleansing after which kingship was sent down again, this time to Kish, and the reign lengths, while still long, become progressively more reasonable, shrinking from millennia to centuries and eventually to decades, as if the scribes were slowly bringing the narrative down to earth, a process we might call historical deflation. Or maybe they just ran out of space on the tablet. This brings us to another scholarly debate, a lively one about the purpose of the list. Was it a genuine attempt at history, a piece of theological propaganda, or a political tool? The dominant view sees it as a legitimizing document, created to justify the hegemony of a particular city or dynasty, like Isin, which controlled the list's final versions, by showing that kingship was a single, unbroken thread that had passed through various cities and now rested with them. A concept so smooth it could convince you that the previous king, who might have been violently overthrown, was just a temporary placeholder in a divine plan, which is a fantastic way to rebrand a coup. And I imagine the scribes who wrote it were the ancient equivalent of slick political spin doctors, working late nights with their styli to make the current boss look predestined. The fringe interpretation, never one to be outdone, takes the numbers at face value and uses them to support all manner of theories, from a lost civilization with advanced biotech that allowed for extreme longevity to the idea that these were reigns of alien overlords operating on a different galactic time scale, which would make their administrative achievements somewhat less impressive if they had 30,000 years to figure out crop rotation. A joke that probably wouldn't land in a room full of ancient astronaut theorists, who tend to have the humor of a particularly serious doorstop. Let's pause here, in the dim light of our imaginary temple, and consider the sensory details of that scribe's life, the feel of the wet clay, the sound of the stylus making those precise wedge marks, the smell of the oil lamp, the weight of expectation as he compiled names and years that stretched back into a twilight realm of gods and heroes. He was a bridge between the intangible past and the tangible present, creating a document that would outlive empires, languages, and even the memory of what some of those city names once sounded like when spoken aloud. A humbling thought that makes our own digital records seem fragile by comparison, susceptible to a magnetic pulse or a software update, whereas his work survived fire, flood, and being buried in rubble for 4,000 years, which is a testament to both Mesopotamian engineering and the durability of a good, sun-baked piece of dirt. And as you listen, maybe drifting already, think of the land itself, the alluvial plain built from silt carried down by the twin rivers, a land with no stone, no metals, just mud and water and sun. And from that, they built the first cities, the first states, the first written records, a lesson in making something from nothing that should inspire anyone who has ever looked at their limited resources and felt despair. Because the Sumerians looked at mud and saw potential, saw bricks, saw tablets, saw walls, saw history itself, which is either profoundly optimistic or a sign of severe sunstroke, but I prefer the former. They gave us so much. The concept of 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the lamentation poem, the bureaucracy joke, which is arguably the oldest form of humor after the slapstick, because there is always someone in any era who will find humor in the triplicate form, the misplaced seal, the overly strict temple overseer, a universal constant that connects us across the millennia. So, as we prepare to delve deeper in the next section into the specifics of those antediluvian kings and the great flood story that permeates the list, remember that you are hovering over the very foundation of recorded time, a place where myth and memory are pressed together like layers in a prism. And the only guide is a list that makes no logical sense, and yet all the sense in the world. A paradox written in clay. And if that doesn't make you at least a little bit curious, then you are probably already asleep, which is also a success, I suppose. But stay with me a little longer, as we unpack the notion of kingship descending from heaven, a phrase so loaded with meaning it could sink a scholarly barge, and explore what the Sumerians might have been trying to say about power, order, and the cosmos, all while managing to make the reign of Enmen-Luana of Bad-Tabira, who ruled for 43,200 years, sound like a mundane administrative fact, which is perhaps the greatest magic trick of all, to normalize the utterly fantastical. A skill we seem to have lost in our modern, cynical age, where a politician surviving a single term feels like a miracle. I'll leave you with this thought to ponder as you sink deeper into your pillow. The Sumerian King List, for all its bizarre chronology, represents humanity's first major attempt to impose linear narrative on the chaos of the past, to create a timeline. And in doing so, they invented history as a concept, a structured story of cause and effect, of succession and legacy, and whether the details are accurate is almost beside the point. The point is they felt the need to do it, to reach back and connect themselves to a beginning, a need we still feel today when we trace our family histories or study the origins of the universe, a need to know where we came from, to have a list of our own, even if our kings only reign for a few years and our records are stored in a cloud, not on clay. And on that profoundly cozy, existential note, let's take a very brief pause, just a breath, a moment to adjust your blanket, before we continue into the realm of the gods and the first cities in Section 2, where the numbers get even bigger and the stories even stranger. And I promise at least 3 more jokes about ancient accounting practices, because you've earned it for making it this far into a 3,400-word section about prehistoric Mesopotamian chronology. Which is a sentence I never thought I'd write, but here we are together in the quiet dark, listening for the echo of a stylus on clay. The list begins, as all good things should, with a premise both simple and grand. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. This is our anchor, our starting coordinate in a sea of deep time. And Eridu, we are told by archaeology, was one of the oldest, if not the oldest, Sumerian settlement, founded in the Ubaid period, a place of marsh and mystery, dedicated to Enki, the god of wisdom, water, and craft, a fitting patron for the first city to hold the divine gift of kingship, which apparently came with a manual written in bubbles and river silt. Let's visit Eridu in its prime, through the mind's eye, of course. A cluster of reed houses and mud brick buildings around a central temple platform, the precursor to the ziggurat, a simple raised shrine where the divine and the human met, where the concept of a priest-king, or En, began to take shape, a figure who was both administrator and intercessor, the CEO and head chaplain of the city-state corporation, a dual role that probably led to some tense performance reviews from both the civic board and the divine council of gods. The mainstream historical fact we must cement here is that Eridu, according to both the King List and archaeology, held tremendous cultural and religious significance as the first city, a sort of primordial capital of culture. Excavations there reveal a sequence of temples built one on top of the other over centuries, a vertical timeline of devotion, each new layer trying to get closer to the original sacredness of the place, like spiritual geology. And this physical layering mirrors the conceptual layering of the king list itself, where later kings are stacked upon earlier ones in a grand architecture of legitimacy. Now, the first king in Eridu was Alulim, who ruled for 28,800 years, a tenure so long that if he had instituted a pension plan, the actuaries would have wept into their clay tablets. We know nothing else about him from the list, just his name and his unimaginable reign, a blank slate upon which millennia of speculation have been written, from him being a metaphor for the slow, gradual development of early chiefdoms to, in our quirky fringe interpretation, a literal extraterrestrial administrator who aged very, very slowly due to relativistic effects from traveling near the speed of light. A theory that requires a spectacular misunderstanding of both physics and Mesopotamian archaeology, but does allow for the delightful image of an ancient astronaut trying to explain crop rotation to a Neolithic farmer over the course of several centuries, speaking very, very slowly. His successor, Alaulgar, ruled for 36,000 years, and then 3 more kings in Eridu bring the total years before kingship moved to another city to a cool 64,800 years, a period in which, one assumes, they perfected the art of mudbrick, invented the wheel, wrote the first epic poem about a particularly interesting cloud, and then forgot it all, because the archaeological record shows gradual progress, not sudden, divine-inspired leaps. Which is the frustrating thing about reality. It's often boringly incremental, unlike good fiction or the Sumerian King List. After Eridu, kingship moves to Bad-Tabira, where 3 kings reign for a combined 108,000 years, and here we get names that pop up in other myths, like Enmen-Luana, who is sometimes associated with later wisdom literature, a sage from before the flood, a trope found in many cultures. The pre-cataclysmic superintelligent being who knew all the secrets that were lost, which is a comforting thought, that there was once a golden age of knowledge. Even if it was administered by people who apparently had all the time in the world to write everything down but somehow didn't, or if they did, it was on a clay tablet the size of a city block that got recycled into potting soil after the flood. Then kingship goes to Larak for 1 king, Sippar for 1 king, and Shuruppak for 1 king, each reigning for periods ranging from 18,600 to 36,000 years. And Shuruppak is crucial because it is the city of the flood hero, Ziusudra in Sumerian, later Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and Noah in the Hebrew Bible, a narrative connection that shows how this list is woven into a broader Mesopotamian mythic tapestry. A shared story of catastrophe and renewal that resonated across the ancient Near East, a blockbuster plotline so good everyone wanted a version for their own culture. Now, a scholarly debate of the quieter, more technical variety, the source of these immense numbers. Some scholars, like the great Thorkild Jacobsen, proposed they might represent not solar years but shorter, possibly seasonal units, or that they are products of a sexagesimal, base 60, mathematical system being applied to symbolic or mythological time, creating a kind of sacred numerology. Others suggest they represent the reigns of dynasties or cities personified as single rulers, a poetic compression of time. And a few brave souls have tried to link them to astronomical cycles, like processional ages, which sounds wonderfully mystical until you try to make the math work and end up with a headache, and a newfound respect for ancient scribes who just made really, really big numbers up. The fringe, naturally, has a field day. If you take the numbers literally and assume a modern human lifespan, you could argue there were over 1,000 generations compressed into those antediluvian reigns, which would mean the list omitted 999 out of every 1,000 kings, making it the world's most aggressive abridgment. A Spark Notes version of prehistory where only the cover page survives. A joke that might make you smile if you're struggling to stay awake, which is fine. That's what I'm here for. To gently bore you into a state of blissful unconsciousness with details of Mesopotamian chronography. But let's think about the flood for a moment, the Great Reset. The Sumerian flood story, known from fragments of a poem called the Eridu Genesis, tells of the gods deciding to send a flood to destroy humanity, a decision one god, Enki, reveals to the pious king Ziusudra of Shuruppak, instructing him to build a great boat and preserve life. After the flood subsides, Ziusudra offers sacrifices and is granted eternal life in the distant land of Dilmun, a happy ending of sorts, unless you were anyone else on the planet, in which case it was a very bad day indeed. This story is embedded in the King List as the pivotal event. The list says, "Then the flood swept over, and after the waters recede, kingship is sent down again from heaven, this time to the city of Kish, and the post-diluvian rains, while still lengthy, are orders of magnitude shorter, as if the gods had turned down the dial on divine longevity, perhaps realizing that immortal kings led to administrative stagnation and a serious backlog in court cases." The mainstream fact here is that there is geological and archaeological evidence for major, catastrophic flooding events in the region of southern Mesopotamia around the end of the Uruk period, around 2900 BCE. Cores taken from the soil show layers of silt consistent with massive inundations, and at the site of Shuruppak, there is a sediment layer that could correspond to such a disaster. So the flood story likely has a basis in a real, traumatic environmental event that was seared into cultural memory, becoming the defining before and after marker for all subsequent history, a tale told and retold until it became the property of gods and kings. Which is how you turn a natural disaster into a theological and political tool, a process we might call narrative repurposing. And it's a very human thing to do, to take chaos and weave it into a story where someone, usually a divinely approved someone, is in control. The quirky interpretation, of course, goes further, suggesting the flood was a deliberate act by those ancient alien overlords to wipe out a failed human experiment, a cosmic Control-Alt-Delete, with Ziusudra being the one genetically pure or worthy specimen saved in a biopreservation ark. A story that turns a myth about divine caprice and human survival into a sci-fi horror plot. Which is more exciting, but loses the poignant human element of a god betraying the divine counsel to save his favorite worshipper. A story of mercy and cunning that feels more real, more flawed, and more interesting than a sterile laboratory procedure. After the flood, the King List becomes slightly more relatable, though still sprinkled with centuries-long reigns. The first dynasty of Kish produces 23 kings, some with fabulous names like Etana, the shepherd who ascended to heaven on the back of an eagle, a story that sounds like an ancient precursor to aviation disaster tales, and all these kings together ruled for 24,510 years, 3 months, and 312 days. A precision that is both comical and awe-inspiring, as if the scribe had access to a really long-form calendar and felt bad about rounding. Kish held a special place in the Mesopotamian imagination as the city that held kingship after the flood, a place of primordial authority, and archaeology shows it was indeed a major power in the early dynastic period. So here we see the list touching down, however briefly, on the runway of something resembling historical reality, though the flight path there was through clouds of pure myth. Then kingship moves to Uruk, and we start to recognize names that have archaeological and literary corroboration. Enmerkar, Lugalbanda, and the great Gilgamesh himself, who the list says ruled for 126 years, which is still impressively long but at least biologically plausible for a legendary hero, and whose epic adventures would become the world's first literary masterpiece, a story about friendship, loss, and the quest for immortality that resonates because it is so human, so grounded in fear and desire, unlike the list's earlier entries, which feel like celestial bookkeeping. It's here we encounter another scholarly debate, this one about the interplay between the King List and the developing concept of history. Some scholars argue the list represents a stream of tradition, a fluid collection of names and stories that were constantly updated and manipulated to serve contemporary needs. A living document rather than a fixed record, which explains its variations and contradictions, while others see it as a more formal, once-and-for-all compilation meant to canonize a specific version of the past, a closing of the book on fluid oral tradition. And this debate matters because it speaks to how the Sumerians, and later the Akkadians and Babylonians, viewed their own past. Was it a toolbox to be used or a monument to be revered? The answer is probably both, which is the safe, scholarly answer to most debates, and it allows everyone to go home feeling vaguely correct. A diplomatic approach the Sumerian gods, who were always bickering, could have learned from. Imagine the scribe again, perhaps in the city of Isin around 1800 BCE, compiling this list from older sources, from temple talis, from fragments of poetry, from the boasts of rival cities. He is creating order from chaos, a linear sequence from a jumble of competing traditions, and in doing so, he is crafting an identity for his civilization, a story that says, "We are not newcomers. We are the heirs of an unbroken chain of authority that goes back to the creation of the world." A powerful narrative for a civilization surrounded by potential enemies and internal rivalries. A narrative that says stability is possible, even after a flood wipes everything out, because kingship itself is eternal, even if kings are not. A comforting thought in an unstable world. And isn't that what we all want before sleep? A little comfort. A story that suggests order underpins the chaos. The list, for all its absurdity, is deeply comforting in that way. It's a spreadsheet of the cosmos where everything adds up, where every king, no matter how briefly mentioned, has a place and a number of years. A completeness that soothes the anxious mind, which is perhaps why I'm telling you about it now, as you lie in the dark, your own mind perhaps swirling with unordered thoughts of the day. Imagine them as kings on a list, each worry reigning for a certain time, then passing on, succeeded by another, until finally, sleep, the great flood, washes over and resets the system, and you wake with kingship in a new city, a new day. That's the metaphorical take, anyway. The literal take is that you're listening to a man talk about clay tablets for an unreasonably long time. And for that, I both apologize and thank you, because your attention is a gift, even if it's a gift given in a state of semi-consciousness. Let's add a dash of sensory detail to keep you anchored. The sound of the stylus, a squared-off reed pressing into the clay, isn't a scratch, but a soft thump and a squelch, a wet, deliberate sound. The tablet would be held in the left hand, turned as the lines progressed, and the scribe would work quickly before the clay dried, his movements practiced, creating those wedge shapes, horizontal, vertical, diagonal, that conveyed everything from grain measures to the reign of a demigod, a flexibility that is astonishing, that the same mark could mean sheep or king, depending on context, a lesson in linguistic economy we've somehow forgotten in our age of specialized emojis. The tablets themselves, once written, might be sun-dried for temporary records or fired in a kiln for permanence, a process that turned mud into a medium that could survive millennia, a humble alchemy that preserved the voice of a civilization, a voice that speaks to us still in museums and textbooks, saying, "We were here, we counted things, we ruled, we built, we made lists." And that's a powerful statement, perhaps the most human statement of all. And on that note, we must prepare to transition to the next section, where we will explore the political world that produced the list, the rivalries between city-states like Ur, Lagash, and Umma, and the rise of the First Empire under Sargon of Akkad, a figure who conspicuously bends the list's rules, because he wasn't Sumerian, and yet he had to be fitted into the divine scheme, a problem the scribes solved with the flexibility that only true believers or cynical bureaucrats can muster. Which is another joke because they were probably both. But before we go there, let's linger for one more moment in the antediluvian fog, with Alulim and Alaulgar and Enmenluana, figures of pure time who represent the Sumerian answer to the question, what came before? Their answer: order divinely sanctioned, meticulously recorded, and impossibly long. An answer that satisfies the soul if not the historian's calculator. And maybe, as you drift, that's the point. History, before it was a science, was a comfort, a story told to make sense of the world. And the Sumerian King List is the grandfather of all those stories. A bedtime story for a civilization, whispered from the temple walls to the stars, and now whispered again to you in the dark, where numbers lose their meaning and only the story remains. A river of names flowing from a source in heaven, down through Eridu, through the flood, through Kish and Uruk, down to the very moment a scribe puts down his stylus and blows on the clay to dry it. A moment caught forever. A link in a chain that, in a way, includes you listening now. A witness across time, which is a sentimental thought, but sentiment is allowed at this hour, sandwiched between jokes about ancient accounting. So breathe deep, feel the weight of the blanket like the weight of centuries, and let's carry on, downstream on that river of names in the next section. We have passed through the veil of the flood, and the world feels newer, sharper, though still tinged with the mythic. Kingship is now in Kish, and we are entering what scholars call the early dynastic period, roughly 2900 to 350 BCE. A time of fierce competition between Sumerian city-states like Uruk, Lagash, and Umma. A time of walled cities, of armies clashing over fertile fields and water rights, of palaces rising beside temples, and of written records that become suddenly, vividly human. Recording not just grain and sheep, but also the boasts of kings and the lamentations of the defeated. This is the fertile soil from which the King List, in its final form, grew, a world where proving your legitimacy was a matter of life, death, and historical propaganda, and where a good scribe was worth his weight in lapis lazuli, which was imported from far-off Afghanistan, making him a very expensive employee indeed, a fact that probably led to some intense salary negotiations in cuneiform, now lost to time. Our mainstream historical fact for this section is the existence and content of the Stele of the Vultures, a monument from the city of Lagash dating to around 2450 BCE, which depicts the victory of King Enatum over the rival city of Umma in a dispute over a fertile plain. It shows the god Ningirsu holding a net full of captured enemies, and the king leading a phalanx of soldiers, and it is one of the first great pieces of political and military propaganda, a stone tweet saying, "We won, the gods are on our side, and by the way, this land has always been ours." A narrative strategy directly parallel to the King List's project of legitimizing through deep time, proving that if you want to claim something, you should say you've always had it. A principle that applies to border disputes and children arguing over toys, a universal constant of human conflict. The King List in this period becomes a battleground by other means. It shows kingship moving from city to city, Kish to Uruk, Uruk to Ur to Awan, a rhythmic transfer called the transference of kingship that may reflect the historical reality of shifting hegemonies, or may be a later theological construct to explain why no one city held power forever, a sort of divine musical chairs where the music was played by the gods, and the last one sitting got to claim universal rule for a generation or two, which is a more fun way to think about geopolitics. Though I doubt the losers saw it that way, as their cities were being sacked. Now, a quirky interpretation about this period. Some fringe theorists, looking at the rapid development of technology and social organization, posit that the Sumerian city-states were not just competing with each other, but were client states to different factions of those ancient alien Anunnaki, with wars like that between Lagash and Umma being proxy conflicts between alien gods vying for resources or influence, a sort of cosmic Cold War fought with bronze spears and clay tablets. A theory that adds a layer of interstellar intrigue to what was essentially a fight over irrigation ditches. And while it's entertaining, it again robs the Sumerians of their agency, turning them into pawns on a galactic chessboard instead of the ingenious, quarrelsome, ambitious people they were. people who were perfectly capable of starting a war over a field of barley without any extraterrestrial encouragement. Thank you very much. Because human greed needs no alien overlord, it's a homegrown specialty. The scholarly debate we'll tuck in here concerns the historicity of the early post-Diluvian kings. For figures like Etana of Kish or Meskiagasher of Uruk, we have no contemporary archaeological evidence. They exist only in the list and later legends. So are they pure myth, dim memories of real early rulers, or personifications of cities or dynasties? The debate is part of the larger challenge of using the king list as a historical source. It is not a documentary record but a literary and ideological one, and untangling the possible historical kernels from the mythological chaff is a delicate task that has kept many a cuneiformist employed for decades, a task akin to trying to reconstruct a real event from a heavily allegorical poem written centuries later, which is possible but requires a lot of footnotes and cautious language, the academic equivalent of walking on wet clay. Every step leaves an impression. But it might not be the one you intended. Let's focus on a city that looms large in both the list and archaeology, Uruk. In the list, after a period of kingship in Kish, it moves to Uruk, and we get the names of legendary founders. Meskiagasher, son of the sun god Udu, who entered the sea and came out from the mountains, a cryptic phrase that might signify trade or conquest, and then Enmerkar, who the epic tales say journeyed to the mysterious land of Aratta to demand tribute of precious stones and metals, inventing written messages in the process because his herald's mouth was too tired, which is the most bureaucratic origin story for writing ever. Born not from divine inspiration but from a messenger's sore feet and a king's impatience, a joke that probably got a laugh in scribal schools for centuries. Uruk in reality was a marvel, the world's first true megacity, with walls said to have been built by the legendary Gilgamesh himself, and archaeology confirms it was a massive urban center with monumental architecture, including the famous White Temple on its high platform, a place that must have inspired awe, a physical manifestation of the city's claim to power and divine favor, a claim that the king list codifies in writing, because a big wall says, "We are powerful." But a list that says you were the third city to hold kingship from heaven says, "We are eternally legitimate," which is the deeper game being played. Then we have Lugalbanda, the heroic father of Gilgamesh, and then Gilgamesh himself, the king of Uruk who was 2/3 god and 1/3 human, a genetic recipe that must have caused some interesting family dynamics, and who the list says ruled for 126 years, a number that may reflect the length of a dynasty rather than a single lifespan, but which has cemented his legendary status. The wonderful thing about Gilgamesh is that he straddles the line between list and literature. The list records his name and reign length. The Epic of Gilgamesh gives him a personality, a friend, a quest, and a profound existential crisis, making him the world's first fully fleshed-out literary character, a figure who is both on the bureaucratic roll call and in the poetry anthology, a dual citizenship in history and myth that is uniquely Mesopotamian and deeply compelling. Now imagine the scribes of Isin, centuries later, trying to compile a continuous list that includes both the mythical Gilgamesh and the historical kings they knew from other records. They had to create a seamless sequence, a single line of authority, which required some creative splicing, like editing a film where one scene is a grand fantasy epic and the next is a dry economic treatise, and making it flow, a task that deserves respect, even if the final product has the chronological integrity of a soap opera. This brings us to the rise of a figure who challenged the very Sumerian-centric model of the list, Sargon of Akkad. Sargon, who reigned around 2334–279 BCE, was a Semitic-speaking Akkadian who rose to power, traditionally as a cupbearer to the king of Kish, and founded the world's first true empire, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. The king list deals with him in a fascinating way. It says, Sargon, whose father was a gardener, the cupbearer of Baba, the king of Kish, built Agade in the victory of Enlil, and he became king, and he ruled for 56 years. Notice the phrasing. It doesn't say kingship was transferred to Agade. It simply says he became king, a subtle but significant departure from the formula, perhaps reflecting the disruptive, unprecedented nature of his empire, which was not just another city-state taking a turn, but a new kind of political entity, one that required a new narrative, or perhaps the scribes of Isin, who were Sumerian reviving tradition after the Akkadian Empire's fall, weren't quite sure how to fit him in, so they just stated the facts without the usual theological framing. A bureaucratic will just note this anomaly and move on. The mainstream fact about Sargon is that his rise marked a major shift in Mesopotamian history. The first time a ruler unified the region under a single authority, creating an imperial model that would be followed for millennia, and his reign saw the increased use of the Akkadian language alongside Sumerian, the standardization of weights and measures, and the use of art and inscription for imperial propaganda, like the famous victory stele of his grandson Naram-Sin, showing him as a god-king trampling enemies, a visual claim to authority even more dramatic than a long list of years. The quirky interpretation about Sargon is predictably wild. Some alternative histories suggest Sargon himself was a tool of the Anunnaki, selected to unify Mesopotamia under a single administrative rule to more efficiently extract resources, or that his famous origin story, being set adrift in a basket on the Euphrates, like a precursor to Moses, is a trope indicating he was a child of the gods or of a special, possibly hybrid, lineage. A theory that takes a powerful metaphor for divine favor or humble origins and literalizes it into a space opera subplot, which is fun but unnecessary, because the historical Sargon's achievements are dramatic enough without extraterrestrial help, proving that a talented and ruthless human with a good army and better administration can change the world, a lesson both inspiring and terrifying. A scholarly debate rages around the fall of the Akkadian Empire, which the King List simply notes with the transfer of kingship to the Gutian hordes, a period described as a chaotic interlude of non-kingship, a time when who was king, who was not king, which sounds like the ancient equivalent of a government shutdown notice. The debate is over the cause of the collapse. Was it primarily invasion by the Gutian tribes from the mountains, internal rebellion, or a catastrophic climatic event, specifically a widespread drought evidenced by dust layers in geological cores? The answer is likely a combination, a perfect storm of instability that toppled the First Empire, a reminder that even the most powerful human constructions are fragile in the face of environmental and social pressures, a lesson that feels uncomfortably relevant, and which I mention not to cause anxiety, but to note that the Sumerians and Akkadians lived with this fragility constantly, and their drive to create lasting records like the King List was perhaps a defense against it. An attempt to build a monument of words that could outlast any drought or invasion, a pyramid made of language. After the Gutian interlude, the list shows kingship returning to Sumerian hands with the third dynasty of also known as the Ur-III period, a renaissance of Sumerian culture under kings like Ur-Nammu and Shulgi, who ruled from around 2112 to 004 BCE. This period is crucial because it represents the most bureaucratic, administratively dense state the world had yet seen, with archives of tens of thousands of tablets detailing every aspect of the economy. And it is also the time when many scholars believe the earliest versions of the Sumerian King List were compiled or finalized, as the kings of particularly Shulgi, who deified himself, had a strong interest in legitimizing their rule by connecting it to the ancient divine lineage of kingship, creating a canonical past to underpin their highly organized present. Ur-Nammu is famous for creating one of the world's first law codes, predating Hammurabi by centuries, and Shulgi for standardizing the scribal schools and the calendar, efforts to impose order on every aspect of life, an order reflected in the list's neat, sequential structure, where every king has his place in time, no matter how messy reality actually was, which probably involved a lot more arguments about tax exemptions and whose ox gored whose slave. The gritty details that never make it into the grand historical narratives but fill the smaller tablets, the footnotes of history. The fringe interpretation of the Ur-III period sometimes casts it as a theocratic dictatorship under the control of a priestly elite in direct communication with the Anunnaki, using the rigid bureaucracy and the king list as tools of social control to maintain a slave population for building ziggurats and mining operations. A dystopian vision that overlooks the complex social contracts and economic interdependence of Mesopotamian society, reducing it to a sci-fi tyranny, which is less interesting than the reality of a society trying, with remarkable sophistication, to manage resources, honor the gods, and navigate the challenges of a precarious environment, all while arguing about who owned which field, a very human endeavor. As we navigate this period, let's add some ASMR-like sensory details. Imagine the vast archives of Ur, rooms filled with neatly organized shelves of clay tablets, each labeled, each a tiny piece of the state machinery, the air cool and still, the only sound the occasional shuffle of a scribe's sandals or the scritch of a stylus on a new tablet, a hive of quiet administrative activity that underpinned an empire, a hum of bureaucracy that was, in its way, the sound of civilization itself, a sound not so different from the hum of your fan or the quiet rustle of your sheets. A baseline of order against the silence of chaos. And the scribes themselves, the keepers of the list, were educated in rigorous schools where they learned thousands of cuneiform signs, mathematics, and literature, copying and recopying texts until they were perfect, a process that could involve corporal punishment for mistakes, which adds a certain tension to the idea of a peaceful, scholarly life, and makes our modern frustration with autocorrect seem trivial by comparison, a joke that hopefully lightens the mood. Because thinking about ancient school discipline is not the most relaxing thought before bed, unless you have particularly strong feelings about pedagogical methods. The King List, in its Ur-III or later Isin-Larsa period form, was likely one of these canonical texts, copied by students as an exercise and by master scribes as an official document, its very act of copying reinforcing its truth, each new impression in clay saying, "This is the way it was, this is the order of things," a powerful form of cultural transmission that embedded the narrative deep in the collective consciousness, so deep that even when Sumerian ceased to be a spoken language, replaced by Akkadian, the list was still copied and studied, a sacred relic of a foundational past. And as you lie there, perhaps feeling the weight of all these names and years, remember that this list was also a living thing, updated, altered, and manipulated. For instance, the version we have from Isin likely exaggerates the prominence of Isin's own dynasty, downplaying rivals, a reminder that history, even ancient history, is written by the winners, or at least by the winners' secretaries, who had the unenviable task of making their boss look good for all eternity without technically lying, a dance around truth that is as old as power itself, and which gives the list a layer of sly political intrigue beneath its surface of dry chronology. We are nearing the end of this section's journey, having moved from the mythic post-flood kings to the rise of empire and the bureaucratic state, seeing how the king list served as both a product of and a tool for that evolution, a mirror and a mold for Mesopotamian ideas of power and time. As we prepare to move into the final phases of the list and its legacy in the next section, let the rhythm of these transfers of kingship, Kish, Uruk, Awan, Kish again, lull you like a slow pendulum, a metronome of millennia, each tick a city rising, each talk a city fatting, but the pendulum itself, the idea of kingship swinging on forever, a constant in a changing world, which is a soothing abstraction to cling to in the dark. And on that almost poetic note, I'll leave you with a final thought for this segment. The Sumerian King List, for all its flaws, represents a monumental intellectual achievement, the attempt to create a unified, coherent timeline of the past, an early experiment in historiography that sought to answer the big questions of origins, continuity, and authority. It is, in essence, a story, and we are hardwired to love stories, especially ones that promise order, that tell us where we came from and by implication who we are. So as you listen, you are participating in that ancient tradition, not of ruling cities but of seeking meaning in the past, of trying to make the pieces fit, a comforting, fundamentally human activity that is perhaps the best precursor to sleep, because it allows the busy, waking mind to settle into a narrative, to follow a thread until it runs out, and then, finally, to let go. So follow this thread a little further with me, into the twilight of the list and its rediscovery in the modern world in Section 4, where we'll meet archaeologists, decipherers, and the strange journey of a clay prism from the ruins of a library to the quiet of a museum case. A journey almost as long as the reign of a Lulim, though thankfully, much easier to fit into a bedtime story. The narrative of the list now approaches its own historical horizon. The kingship after the fall of passes to the cities of Isin and Larsa, a period of rivalry in the early 2nd millennium BCE, and it is likely in Isin, under the dynasty of Damikaleshu or thereabouts, that the version of the king list we know best, the Well-Blundell prism, was inscribed, a summary of the past to legitimize the present, a final, grand statement of Sumerian historical tradition before the region was dominated by Amorites and then Babylonians. A tradition that would be borrowed, adapted, but never quite replicated with the same blend of myth and meticulous record-keeping. This prism, a four-sided clay object about the size of a large orange, now resides in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and it is our primary witness, a physical artifact that made the journey from a Sumerian library, probably in a city like Larsa or Nippur, through millennia of burial to its discovery in the early 20th century, a journey that is a story in itself, a tale of dirt, scholarship, and a bit of luck. Our mainstream historical fact for this section is the story of the prism's discovery and decipherment. It was purchased on the antiquities market in 1922 by a collector named Herbert Well-Blundell, who then lent it to the Ashmolean, where it was studied by the pioneering Sumerologist, Rev. Archibald Sayce, and later by others, its cuneiform signs slowly giving up their secrets to reveal the staggering chronology we've been exploring, a process that connected the dots between the biblical and classical flood stories and a real Mesopotamian document, sending shockwaves through the understanding of ancient history and causing more than one Victorian scholar to spill his tea in astonishment, a reaction that is always fun to imagine, the clash of pious expectation and a tablet full of gods and 30,000-year reigns. The prism's text ends with the dynasty of Isin, around 1790 BCE, closing the canonical Sumerian King List narrative, though later Babylonian and Assyrian king lists would continue the tradition, but without the fantastical antediluvian spans, focusing more on the historical succession of rulers, as if the later cultures decided the metaphor had served its purpose, and it was time for more straightforward accounting, which is a shame. Because a Babylonian king list that included a 20,000-year reign would have been a fantastic piece of propaganda, but perhaps they felt they couldn't top the Sumerian original, so they didn't try, a rare instance of historical humility. Now, a quirky interpretation about the prism and its survival. Some fringe thinkers see its preservation as not accidental, but guided by a secret society, or even by the descendants of the Sumerian priesthood who wanted this knowledge to be rediscovered in the modern era to awaken humanity to its true origins, a sort of ancient time capsule planted in the Mesopotamian soil, waiting for the right moment to be unearthed and decode our cosmic heritage. A theory that gives the object a mystical agency and turns archaeologists into unwitting actors in a grand, preordained plan, which is more romantic than the reality of haphazard digging, illicit antiquities trading, and academic rivalry, but does make for a better movie plot, though the real story has plenty of drama, involving world wars, colonial politics, and the painstaking work of decipherment, which is dramatic in its own slow-burn way. The scholarly debate we'll engage here is a classic one: the purpose of the King List in its final form. Was it primarily a school text, a scribal exercise used to train future administrators in the Sumerian language and the grand sweep of tradition? Was it a liturgical or ritual text, recited during ceremonies to invoke the legitimacy of the current king by nomming all his predecessors? Or was it a political document, pure and simple, a piece of state propaganda meant for display or dissemination to subject cities? The consensus leans toward it being a bit of all three, but the debate highlights the multifaceted nature of such texts in Mesopotamian society, where the lines between education, religion, and politics were beautifully blurred, a holistic approach to knowledge that we've somewhat lost in our age of specialization, where a single document is unlikely to serve as a textbook, a prayer book, and a press release, though social media posts sometimes attempt this ambitious trifecta, usually with less success and far poorer longevity than a baked clay prism. Let's dwell on the scribal school, or edubba, for a moment to ground this in a human context. Imagine a young student, the son of an elite family or perhaps a talented commoner, sitting in a courtyard, his clay tablet and stylus in hand, copying lines from a master text, proverbs, literary dialogues, mathematical tables, and perhaps the King List. He would learn to write the names of kings he knew were legendary, and some he might believe were historical, internalizing the idea of a continuous, divinely ordered past that justified the social hierarchy he was part of, a powerful form of ideological conditioning that also happened to teach him impeccable grammar and penmanship, a two-for-one deal in societal maintenance. The process of copying was imperfect, of course, which is why we have different versions of the list with variations in names and reign lengths, the ancient equivalent of a typo in a sacred text, a there instead of there, but with cosmic implications, a thought that should comfort anyone who has ever made a mistake at work, because even the keepers of eternal truths sometimes pressed a wedge in the wrong spot and had to smoosh the clay and start again, a humble, human moment in the grand project of history-making. After the Isin-Larsa period, Mesopotamia was dominated by the Babylonians, first under Hammurabi, famous for his law code, who would have had his own king list, one that connected him to the earlier traditions but placed Babylon at the center of the universe, a move of cultural appropriation and rebranding that is standard practice for rising powers, like a new company buying an old, respected brand and putting its logo on it. The Assyrians to the north also kept meticulous king lists, but theirs were more straightforwardly historical, tracking the succession of rulers in a single line, with none of the city-hopping or millennial reigns of the Sumerian version, though they did claim their kings were chosen by the gods, because some traditions are too good to drop entirely. The Sumerian King List, as a specific genre, faded, but its influence permeated the region's historical consciousness, providing a model for how to think about the past, as a linear sequence of legitimate holders of power, a model that would indirectly influence later chroniclers, including those who wrote the biblical genealogies, which also feature long lifespans before a flood and a more compressed timeline after. A structural similarity that is not coincidence but a reflection of a shared Mesopotamian cultural milieu, a fact that caused much controversy when it was first discovered, because nothing unsettles a certain kind of certainty like finding out your sacred story has older, polytheistic cousins, a revelation that is either deeply troubling or wonderfully enriching, depending on your perspective, and which we won't resolve tonight, as it's better for sleeping to let such grand questions hover unanswered in the dim room. Now, fast forward through centuries, through the fall of Babylon and Assyria, through the rise of Persia, Greece, Rome, through the Islamic Golden Age, through the Ottoman Empire to the 19th century, when European explorers began to poke at the great mounds, or tells, that dotted the Iraqi landscape. Mounds that local tradition sometimes associated with ancient cities but which were largely silent, waiting for the spade. The decipherment of cuneiform was one of the great intellectual adventures of the modern age, beginning with the trilingual Behistun inscription in Persia, which played the same role for cuneiform as the Rosetta Stone did for Egyptian hieroglyphs, a key that unlocked not just one language but several, including Old Persian, Elamite, and Akkadian. And through Akkadian, the even older Sumerian language was eventually deciphered, a linguistic archaeology that peeled back layer after layer of time, revealing a civilization that had been utterly forgotten, its very existence unsuspected until the tablets began to speak, a humbling reminder of how fragile memory is, and how much can be lost, a thought that might make you hug your pillow a little tighter, as if to hold onto the present moment before it, too, becomes a layer in a tell. The quirky interpretation of this rediscovery is, as you might expect, flavored with conspiracy. Some suggest that the decipherment was too quick, too neat, implying that powers that we already knew about Sumer and were guiding the process to slowly release information about our alien origins, or that certain tablets, possibly containing explosive technological or spiritual secrets, were found and immediately locked away in museum basements or private collections, hidden from the public to maintain the status quo, a theory that underestimates the sheer, overwhelming volume of tablets that were found. Hundreds of thousands, and the very public, very slow and very argumentative process of academic publication, where every new translation is fought over by experts with strong opinions and fragile egos, a process about as secretive and coordinated as a toddler's birthday party, which is to say, not at all. The real story is messy and beautiful. Self-taught linguists, dedicated archaeologists, local diggers, museum curators, all piecing together a lost world from broken fragments, a monumental jigsaw puzzle where the picture on the box had been lost, and it is a testament to human curiosity and perseverance, a story that should inspire us because it shows that lost things can be found, that forgotten voices can be heard again. Even if it takes 4,000 years and a lot of guesswork about what a particular wedge combination might mean for reed basket versus royal decree. As the 20th century progressed, more copies and fragments of the King List were found, allowing scholars to compare versions and see how the text evolved, a textual criticism that revealed the fingerprints of editors across centuries, a genealogy of the document itself, which is a suitably meta pursuit for a list about genealogy. This brings us to a modern scholarly debate, which is less about the list's ancient purpose and more about its modern interpretation. How should we, today, understand and teach the Sumerian King List? Is it best presented as a curious artifact of mythohistory, a case study in ancient propaganda, or as a serious, if flawed, source for early Mesopotamian chronology? Different textbooks and documentaries take different approaches, some emphasizing the fantastical numbers to capture interest, others downplaying them to focus on the historical kernels, and this debate reflects our own cultural attitudes toward the past. Do we value it for its factual content or for its cultural and symbolic meaning? The answer, of course, is both, but balancing them is an art, one I am attempting right now, with jokes sprinkled in like raisins in a very dense chronological pudding to keep it palatable as you drift toward sleep. Now let's bring the sensory experience full circle. From the scribe's hands in 1800 BCE to the archaeologist's hands in 1922 CE, the prism felt the same, cool, heavy, gritty with age. The archaeologist might have brushed the dirt from its sides, seeing the neat columns of text emerge, feeling the thrill of connection across an abyss of time, a thrill that is a form of time travel, accessible to anyone who holds an ancient object and wonders about the person who made it. A shared moment of creation and discovery that collapses millennia, a magic trick we can still perform in museums, by looking closely and letting imagination do the work. And you, listening, are performing a version of that magic now, holding the story in your mind, a story that has been pressed into clay, buried, dug up, deciphered, and now whispered into the dark, a chain of transmission that is, in its way, as miraculous as the list's claim of kingship from heaven, because it's real, it happened, and you are a link in it. A passive but essential one, the audience without whom the story ceases to be told. A responsibility I hope doesn't keep you awake, because your only job is to listen, and maybe to dream of ziggurats and endless processions of kings. We are nearing the end of our exploration of what came before the list, and the list itself. In the next section, we will pull back and look at the broader legacy of this document, its impact on our understanding of human history, and why a seemingly dry list of names and years continues to fascinate, confuse, and inspire, even in our age of digital information and short attention spans, a testament to the enduring power of a good list, especially one that starts with the heavens and a very, very long stopwatch. But before we move on, let's pause and acknowledge the silence that followed the end of the Sumerian world. Their language died, their cities were abandoned or rebuilt by others, their gods were renamed and absorbed, but the list survived, a whisper in the clay, a stubborn thread of memory that refused to be completely cut, and that in itself is a kind of victory, a victory of the scribe over oblivion, which is perhaps the deepest human hope, to be remembered, to have our name on a list, even if it's just for a reasonable number of years, not 28,800, because that would be excessive and hard to fit on a business card. So, as you lie in the comforting dark, let the absurdity of those numbers wash over you, not as a problem to be solved, but as a mystery to be savored, a testament to the human imagination's ability to conceive of deep time, to reach for origins in a way that is both grandiose and deeply earnest. The Sumerians were telling us something about the nature of power and time. That legitimacy comes from antiquity, that order is divinely ordained, and that even the greatest flood cannot erase the continuity of kingship, ideas that have shaped political thought ever since, for better or worse, and which continue to echo in our own discourses about tradition and authority, though we now use terms like mandate and precedent instead of kingship descended from heaven. A shift in vocabulary, but not always in underlying concept. A joke about political science that I'll leave for you to unpack in your dreams, or maybe just ignore in favor of more restful imagery, like sheep, but not the kind you count, the kind that wander the green fields of ancient Sumer, blissfully unaware of the bureaucratic apparatus tracking their wool output on a clay tablet somewhere. On that deliberately bucolic and boring note, let's prepare for the penultimate section, where we tie these threads together and ask the big, sleepy question. What does it all mean for us here now, in the 21st century, listening to a story from the dawn of civilization as we try to fall asleep? The answer, like the list, might be both profound and pleasantly nonsensical, a perfect combination for the threshold of dreams. We have followed the thread from the Ubaid marshes to the scribal schools of Isin, from the antediluvian kings with their implausible reigns to the very real clay prism in Oxford. And now we arrive at the reflective shore, where we ask what this all means, why this particular document, the Sumerian King List, holds such a peculiar grip on the modern imagination, popping up in documentaries, books on ancient mysteries, and even video games. Its blend of the concrete and the fantastical acting as a Rorschach test for our own ideas about history, myth, and human origins. The mainstream historical fact we'll anchor with here is the list's role in shaping our understanding of Mesopotamian historiography. It is the quintessential example of how the Sumerians, and by extension early civilizations, conceptualized time and legitimacy, providing a template that influenced later cultures in the region and offering scholars an invaluable, if frustrating, framework for piecing together the sequence of early dynasties. A framework that, when cross-referenced with archaeological findings, economic tablets, and royal inscriptions, helps build a more nuanced picture of early Mesopotamia. a picture that is constantly being revised with new discoveries, because history is not a static list but a living conversation, a fact that should comfort you if you've ever worried about getting things wrong, because even the experts are always adjusting their timelines, just usually without the drama of a 36,000-year miscalculation. The list forces us to confront the different ways humans record their past, as linear narrative, as cyclical pattern, as divine drama, or as administrative record, and the Sumerians, in their characteristic both-and approach, did all of it at once, creating a document that is simultaneously a myth, a political tool, a school text, and a historical source, a multitasking marvel that puts our modern specialized documents to shame. Though I doubt a corporate annual report would be improved by adding a prologue about kingship descending from heaven and a few rulers with 20,000-year tenures. But it's an idea, something for the board to consider to really impress the shareholders. Now, for a final quirky interpretation, one that takes the list's enduring mystery and runs with it into the sunset. There is a small but vocal community of thinkers who believe the list is not just a cultural artifact, but a coded message, perhaps containing advanced mathematical or astronomical knowledge encoded in the reign lengths, a cipher left by a lost high civilization for future generations to unlock, a sort of Stonehenge made of numbers on clay. They point to the sums of the antediluvian reigns, the ratios between them, and try to connect them to planetary cycles or even to the dimensions of the Great Pyramid, creating a web of numerological speculation that is impressively creative and almost entirely detached from the cultural context of ancient Mesopotamia, where numbers held symbolic value but were also, importantly, used for counting jars of oil, a dichotomy the fringe often overlooks in its quest for cosmic secrets. A quest that is understandable. We all want the past to hold hidden wisdom, but which can blind us to the more profound, human wisdom already there, in the simple fact of a civilization trying to make sense of itself through list-making, a practice so humble and universal it connects us to them directly, more directly than any convoluted numerological code ever could. The scholarly debate we'll end with is a philosophical one. Does the Sumerian King List represent a primitive form of history, or is it something else entirely, a genre we've lost? Some historians argue it is proto-history, the first stumbling steps toward a critical examination of the past, while others contend it is fundamentally ideological myth, explaining how things came to be rather than recording what actually happened, and that applying the label history to it is an anachronism, imposing modern categories on an ancient mindset. This debate gets to the heart of what history is. Is it the study of past events, or the study of what people believed about the past? The answer, increasingly, is that it's both, and the King List is a perfect case study, a document that tells us little about the actual reigns of a Lulam or a Laogar, but tells us volumes about what the Sumerians in the early 2nd millennium BCE believed about the origins of kingship, time, and their place in the cosmos, which is, in many ways, more valuable than a dry factual chronicle would be, because it lets us into their worldview, their hopes, their need for order. A need we still feel acutely today, especially when trying to organize a busy schedule or understand a chaotic news cycle, tasks that make ruling a Sumerian city-state seem straightforward by comparison, though they probably didn't think so at the time. Let's bring this back to the sensory, to the ASMR-like quality we're aiming for in this bedtime narrative. Think of the weight of time itself, not as an abstraction, but as something almost physical in the Sumerian imagination, a substance that could be measured in years, stacked in layers like the strata of a temple platform, heavy and slow-moving for the gods and early kings, accelerating as it nears the present. A concept that feels true in a visceral way when you consider childhood summers that felt endless and adult years that blur together. A psychological reality the list mirrors in its structure. Whether intentionally or not, and that resonance is part of its power, it feels right, even if it's factually wrong. a paradox that is the secret sauce of many enduring myths. The list also speaks to the human love of cataloging, of collecting and ordering, an impulse that leads to stamp collections, library catalogs and playlists, as well as to king lists. We are pattern-seeking animals, and the list is a grand pattern imposed on the chaos of the past. A satisfying shape that says, first this, then that, and it all adds up to now. A narrative arc that soothes the restless mind, which is perhaps why this story, for all its density, might be helping you drift off, because it imposes a gentle order on the random thoughts of the day, channeling them into a single, flowing stream of names and numbers that eventually becomes a lullaby. And consider the humor, the gentle sarcasm I've sprinkled throughout. It's a defense mechanism against the sheer scale of the subject, a way to make the alien familiar, to bring these distant, semi-divine kings down to earth, to imagine them dealing with petty administrative issues over their millennia-long reigns, because humor is a great leveler, and it reminds us that behind the grand titles and cosmic numbers were people, scribes who got hand cramps, kings who had bad days, farmers who joked about the taxman, a humanity that is constant. A thread that connects us across the millennia, more surely than any genealogical list ever could. So as we approach the final section, where we'll wrap everything up and send you off to sleep, let's consolidate the journey. We started in the time before written memory, guided by the oldest words on clay. We explored the Ubaid and Uruk foundations. We marveled at the antediluvian kings and the flood reset. We tracked the transfer of kingship through rival city-states and empires. We witnessed the list's compilation and rediscovery, and now we're reflecting on its meaning. It's been a long journey, almost as long as Enmen-Luana's reign, but hopefully more engaging and with fewer required sacrifices to the god Enlil, unless you count the sacrifice of your waking consciousness, which I suppose you are making, a willing offering to the god of sleep, who is perhaps a distant cousin of the Sumerian god of dreams, Mamu, who probably had her own temple and priesthood, but sadly, no king list, though I'm sure someone kept a record of particularly significant dreams. Which would be a fascinating tablet to find, a list of ancient nightmares and prophecies, but that's a story for another night. The legacy of the Sumerian King List is, ultimately, the legacy of writing itself. It demonstrates writing's power to create realities, to shape perception, to build bridges across time, both for the Sumerians who used it to legitimize their rulers, and for us who use it to understand them. It is a foundational text in the literal sense. It lays a foundation for how civilizations think about their past, a foundation upon which later historiography, for all its advances in critical method, still indirectly rests, because we still seek origins, we still construct narratives of continuity, and we still argue about who belongs on the list and who doesn't, whether the list is of presidents, celebrities, or influential thinkers. The impulse is the same, a desire to order rank. And remember, a deeply human impulse that started in written form with things like the Sumerian King List. So, as you hover on the edge of sleep, let your mind play with these ideas, not rigorously but softly, like clay under a stylus, forming and reforming impressions. Imagine the scribe, his work done for the day, putting aside his stylus, rubbing his eyes and looking out at the twilight over his city, the smoke from hearth fires rising, the sounds of daily life winding down, a moment of quiet after a day of pressing words into clay, a moment not so different from yours now, the day, work done, the mind settling, the world moving from the sharp lines of day to the soft blur of night. He might have wondered if anyone would ever read his list, if it would matter. We have the answer, it did, it does, and here you are, listening to its echo, a testament to the enduring power of a story, any story, but especially one that begins with the heavens and a very, very long list of names. And on that note, we are ready for the final brief section, a gentle closing of the book, or rather the tablet, a putting away of the stylus, and a sending off into dreams that might, if you're lucky, feature a surprisingly efficient Sumerian administrator offering you a neatly organized scroll of your own life's events, with all the boring parts edited out, and the reign lengths rounded to satisfying, even numbers. A fantasy of order that is, perhaps, the best gift a bedtime history can give. So take a deep, slow breath and let's move to the conclusion. And so we reach the end of our list, the final entry in tonight's chronicle, not of kings, but of ideas about kings, time, and memory, spun from the oldest words pressed into clay. The hum of your fan, the weight of your blanket, the dark room, these are your kingdom now, and your reign, however long or short the night may be, is a peaceful one, free from the burdens of irrigating fields or appeasing touchy gods, though the god of sleep may require some gentle coaxing, a task for which this entire narrative has been but a lengthy, elaborate ritual. We have traveled from the silent, pre-literate world of the Ubaid to the bustling, bureaucratic world of the Sumerian city-states, always circling that central, enigmatic document, the King List, a text that is both a product of its time and a timeless puzzle, a mirror held up to humanity's need for order, legitimacy, and connection to a meaningful past. Its numbers are impossible, its early kings are mythical, its purpose was pragmatic yet profound, and its survival is a minor miracle. It teaches us that history begins not with facts, but with stories, and that the stories we tell about our origins shape our present in powerful ways, a lesson as relevant for ancient Sumer as it is for any modern nation crafting its founding narrative. The list is a reminder that the past is always being reconstructed, curated, and sometimes invented by those who hold the stelae of power, but it is also a testament to the enduring human spirit that seeks to understand, to record, to leave a mark saying, "We were here, we ruled, we built, we wrote this down." As you drift, let go of the specifics. The 28,800 years, the city names, the scholarly debates, and hold onto the feeling, the sensation of deep time, of layers upon layers of human endeavor, resting quietly beneath the soil of present consciousness, a foundational stratum of dreams. The Sumerian King List does not give us an accurate timeline of early Mesopotamia, but it gives us something perhaps more valuable, a window into the mind of a civilization at the dawn of history, grappling with the big questions of where they came from and why their world was ordered as it was. And in that struggle, they created a work of imagination, administration, and ambition that still captivates us today. So, as the final words of this script are spoken, imagine the clay prism, cool and silent in its museum case, its work done, its story told once more, carried on the quiet voice in your ears out into the night. To you, a listener in the far future, a link in an unbroken chain of curiosity that stretches back to the first scribe who pressed wedge into wet earth and began a list. Let your breathing slow match the rhythm of a slow-flowing river, the Euphrates under a starry sky, carrying the silt of ages toward a distant sea. Feel the weight of your body sinking into the bed, as a tablet might settle into the dust of a ruined library finding its rest. The journey is over. The list is complete. Your watch is ended. Allow the darkness to become the great flood, washing over the day's concerns, resetting the slate for a fresh start with the new dawn, when kingship will descend again in the form of morning light, and you will rise, perhaps not to rule a city, but to face your own day, refreshed and subconsciously aware that you are part of a story far older and grander than any single day. Thank you for listening, for lending your imagination to this trip back to the very beginnings of history. Wherever you are, whatever the hour, I wish you a deep and dream-filled sleep, free from administrative worries, divine disfavor, or any reigns lasting longer than a good night's rest. The story is done. The clay is dry. The light is out. End of script. Sweet dreams.